The small county courthouse stood quietly on that crisp autumn morning, its weathered brick walls holding no hint of the drama about to unfold inside. The case seemed straightforward at first, a custody battle between divorced parents, the kind that happened every day in family courts across the country. But what made this case different was 7-year-old Amy, a bright-eyed little girl in a blue polka dot dress who was about to change everything. The courtroom buzzed with hushed conversations as people filed in. Amy's father, a well-dressed businessman in his early 40s, sat confidently at one table with his expensive lawyer. Her mother, looking tired but determined in her modest dress, sat at the other table, represented by a public defender. The contrast between the two sides was stark, wealth and influence on one side, modest means on the other. "All rise," called the bailiff as Judge Patricia Reynolds entered the courtroom. The judge, known for her fair but no-nonsense approach, surveyed the room with experienced eyes. She had handled hundreds of custody cases, but something about this one felt different from the start. Amy's father had filed for full custody, claiming his ex-wife was an unfit mother. His testimony painted a picture of neglect and instability, missed doctor's appointments, late pickups from school, and a constantly changing work schedule that left Amy with different babysitters every week. His words were carefully chosen, his demeanor professional and composed. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady, "I only want what's best for my daughter. I can provide her with stability, the best schools, and the attention she deserves. Her mother's situation isn't conducive to proper child rearing." The mother sat quietly, wiping away tears as her ex-husband's testimony continued. Her public defender did his best to counter the allegations, but against the father's polished presentation and expert witnesses, it seemed like an uphill battle. The court-appointed child psychologist testified about the importance of stability in a child's life, and the father's lawyer skillfully used this to support their case. But then came the moment that would change everything. When it was time for Amy to speak to the judge in chambers, something unexpected happened. Instead of following the bailiff, she stood up right there in the courtroom, her small voice cutting through the formal atmosphere like a bell. "I need to say something," she announced, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The judge, surprised but intrigued, nodded for her to continue. What followed would leave the entire courtroom in stunned silence. "Daddy is lying," Amy said clearly, her voice trembling but determined. "He told me I had to say Mommy was bad, or I wouldn't get to see my puppy anymore. He said if I told anyone, something bad would happen to Mommy." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Amy's father's composed facade cracked slightly, his face paling. His lawyer quickly stood to object, but Judge Reynolds raised her hand for silence, her attention focused entirely on the little girl who wasn't finished speaking. Amy continued, her words tumbling out like a dam breaking. She told of how her father had coached her on what to say to the judge, how he'd promised her expensive toys if she helped him win. She spoke about the times he'd made her lie to her mother about where they'd been, and how he'd told her it was all just a game. But most importantly, she talked about her life with her mother, the bedtime stories every night, even when her mom was tired from working 2 jobs. The way her mother never missed a school event, even if it meant switching shifts at the diner. The warm hugs, the patient homework help, and the unconditional love that filled their modest apartment. As Amy spoke, her mother covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. The truth was finally coming out, but not in the way anyone had expected. Judge Reynolds listened intently, her expression grave as she watched not just Amy, but the reactions of both parents. The father's carefully constructed case was unraveling thread by thread, exposed by the innocent honesty of his own daughter. His lawyer sat speechless, knowing that no legal argument could counter the raw truth coming from a child's lips. The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom. The father's previous testimony now cast in a completely different light. What had seemed like concern for his daughter's welfare was revealed as a calculated attempt to manipulate the court system. The expensive suits and professional demeanor couldn't hide the truth any longer. he had tried to use his own child as a pawn in his game for control. As the first part of this dramatic day in court drew to a close, Judge Reynolds called for a brief recess. The atmosphere in the courtroom was electric with tension. Amy sat close to her mother, finally free of the burden of secrets she'd been forced to carry. The truth had begun to emerge, but this was only the beginning of a story that would challenge everything the court thought they knew about this case. The morning's events had set the stage for what would become one of the most memorable custody hearings in the county's history. As people filed out for the recess, one thing was clear: the voice of one brave little girl had just changed the course of justice, and there was still more truth to come. When court resumed after the recess, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Judge Reynolds returned to her bench with a stern expression that made even the most seasoned lawyers in the room sit up straighter. The father's confident demeanor had crumbled, replaced by nervous glances at his lawyer and increasingly frequent loosening of his tie. "In light of the testimony we've heard," Judge Reynolds began, her voice carrying the weight of decades of experience, "I'm ordering an immediate investigation into the allegations of witness tampering and coercion of a minor." She turned her attention to Amy's father, who seemed to shrink under her gaze. "Sir, you should be aware that these are serious accusations that extend far beyond the scope of a simple custody hearing." The father's lawyer scrambled to his feet, attempting to salvage what he could of their case. "Your Honor, my client maintains that these are simply the confused statements of a child who may be experiencing pressure from both sides of a difficult situation." But Judge Reynolds wasn't finished. She called forth the court-appointed child advocate who had been silently observing the proceedings. The advocate, a gentle-faced woman with gray-streaked hair, approached the bench with a thick folder in her hands. "Ms. Thompson," the judge addressed her, "you've been working with Amy for the past 3 months. Have you observed anything that would corroborate either version of events we've heard today?" The child advocate adjusted her glasses and opened her folder. "Yes, Your Honor. During my sessions with Amy, I noticed several concerning patterns in her behavior. When discussing her father, she showed signs of anxiety and would often check the doors and windows of my office, as if worried about being overheard." As Ms. Thompson continued her testimony, she revealed detailed notes from her sessions with Amy. She described how the little girl would become physically ill before scheduled visits with her father, how she'd draw pictures of herself with her mother that she'd quickly hide when anyone entered the room, and how she'd recently begun having nightmares about keeping secrets. The mother listened intently, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Each revelation seemed to both pain and relieve her, pain at learning what her daughter had been going through, and relief that the truth was finally coming to light. Her public defender, who had seemed overwhelmed earlier, now sat up straighter, his notepad filling with rapid observations. Then came another surprising turn. A school counselor who had been subpoenaed stepped forward. She shared how Amy's behavior had changed dramatically over the past year. Amy went from being an outgoing, confident child to becoming withdrawn and anxious, the counselor testified. "She would often ask me if it was okay to tell the truth even if someone important told you not to." The father's face grew increasingly pale as more witnesses came forward. His expensive lawyer's objections became more desperate, but each one was carefully overruled by Judge Reynolds, who was building a clear picture of systematic manipulation and emotional abuse. A breakthrough came when the father's housekeeper, who hadn't been scheduled to testify, asked to speak. Despite the father's lawyer's vehement objections, Judge Reynolds allowed it. The housekeeper, her hands shaking but her voice steady, described overhearing multiple phone calls where the father had coordinated with his lawyer about coaching the kid and making sure she sticks to the script. "I couldn't stay quiet anymore," the housekeeper said, her voice thick with emotion. "Not after seeing that little girl cry herself to sleep so many nights, clutching a photo of her mother." The judge then did something unprecedented. She called Amy back to her chambers, but this time with both the child advocate and a court reporter present. What happened in that private conversation would later be described as both heartbreaking and enlightening. When they returned to the courtroom, Judge Reynolds's decision was swift and decisive. This court is hereby ordering an immediate suspension of the father's visitation rights pending a full investigation into allegations of emotional abuse and witness tampering. Her gavel crack echoed through the stunned courtroom. But she wasn't finished. Furthermore, I'm ordering a complete review of all previous testimony and evidence presented in this case. Mr. Davidson, she addressed the father directly, you should secure criminal defense counsel immediately. This court takes attempts to manipulate justice very seriously, especially when those attempts involve the exploitation of a child. The mother, who had remained stoic throughout most of the proceedings, finally broke down in tears, not of sadness, but of relief. Amy ran to her, and the two embraced as the courtroom erupted in murmurs and movement. As court officers approached the father, his expensive suit no longer seemed to carry the same authority it had just hours before. His lawyer was already on his phone, presumably calling in reinforcements for what was about to become a much more serious legal battle. The day's proceedings had exposed more than just lies in a custody battle. They had revealed how wealth and influence could be used to manipulate the system, and how the bravery of a single child could bring truth to light. As Amy left the courthouse holding her mother's hand, several of the court staff members smiled at her, some wiping away tears. The story was far from over. The investigation was just beginning, and there would be more revelations to come. But for now, a little girl could go home with her mother, free from the burden of lies she'd been forced to carry. As they walked down the courthouse steps, Amy looked up at the sky and smiled, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from her in months. The autumn wind scattered leaves around their feet as they walked to their car, and for the first time in a long while, both mother and daughter felt like they could breathe freely again. But this was just the beginning of a journey that would impact not just their lives, but the entire community's understanding of justice, truth, and the power of a child's voice. The days following the courthouse revelation brought waves of change through the small community. What had started as a private family matter had transformed into something much larger, touching hearts and changing lives far beyond the courtroom walls. The district attorney's office launched a thorough investigation into the father's actions. Investigators uncovered a trail of manipulated evidence and witness intimidation that stretched back months before the custody hearing. Bank records showed suspicious payments to various individuals who had been prepared to testify about the mother's supposed negligence, testimony that would never see the light of day. Amy and her mother began the healing process in their small apartment above the diner where her mother worked. The owner, a kind-hearted woman who had always suspected something wasn't right about the father's claims, gave Amy's mother more flexible hours so she could spend more time with her daughter. Regular customers who had known Amy since she was a toddler brought small gifts and words of encouragement. "I remember when you used to sit at the counter, coloring while your mama worked," said one elderly regular customer, placing a brand new set of colored pencils on Amy's table. "You always drew the truth, even when you were tiny. Hearts and rainbows and your mama's smile." The local school principal called a special meeting to address the situation. Amy's teachers shared their observations from the past year, how the bright, engaging student had become increasingly withdrawn, especially after phone calls or visits with her father. The school counselor implemented new training for staff members about recognizing signs of emotional manipulation in children of divorce. One afternoon, as Amy sat doing homework at her usual booth in the diner, a young woman approached their table. She introduced herself as a former client of Amy's father's company. With tears in her eyes, she shared her own story of how he had used similar tactics to manipulate business dealings, threatening to expose personal information about her family if she didn't agree to his terms. "Your daughter's courage," she told Amy's mother, sliding her business card across the table, "gave me the strength to come forward. My law firm wants to help, pro bono. It's time someone stood up to him." The investigation revealed a pattern that stretched beyond family court. Amy's father had built his business empire on manipulation and coercion, using his wealth and connections to silence anyone who stood in his way. But he had never expected his carefully constructed world to be dismantled by the honest words of his 7-year-old daughter. The child advocate, Ms. Thompson, continued working with Amy, but their sessions took on a different tone. Instead of trying to uncover hidden truths, they focused on healing and moving forward. Amy's nightmares began to decrease, replaced by peaceful sleep and dreams of happy futures. "Today Amy told me she wants to be a judge when she grows up," Ms. Thompson shared with Amy's mother during one of their progress meetings. "She says she wants to help other kids tell their truth." The transformation in her these past weeks has been remarkable. The mother's public defender, inspired by the case, reached out to his law school alumni network. Soon, a team of experienced family law attorneys volunteered to help strengthen the mother's case and ensure all legal proceedings moved forward properly. They were determined to prevent the father from using his wealth to influence the justice system again. One morning, Amy's mother found a pile of letters in their mailbox. They were from other parents in similar situations, sharing their stories and thanking Amy for her bravery. Some had already begun speaking up in their own custody cases, inspired by the little girl who dared to tell the truth. The father's business partners began distancing themselves as more details emerged. His carefully crafted public image crumbled as former employees came forward with their own stories of manipulation and ethical breaches. The man who had once dominated boardrooms with his presence now found himself increasingly isolated. The housekeeper who had testified received support from unexpected quarters. When the father's lawyer attempted to threaten her with legal action, 3 prestigious law firms offered to represent her pro bono. Her courage in speaking up had sparked a movement within the domestic worker community, encouraging others to report workplace abuse and manipulation. Amy's story reached the state capitol, where legislators began drafting new protections for children in custody cases. They called it Amy's Law, a set of guidelines designed to prevent witness tampering and coercion in family court proceedings. The draft legislation included provisions for independent child advocates and increased scrutiny of evidence in high-conflict custody cases. As autumn turned to winter, Amy and her mother settled into a new normal. Their apartment above the diner became a symbol of resilience in the community. Regular customers would often look up at their windows, where Amy had hung her artwork, bright, hopeful drawings that seemed to reflect her healing spirit. The mother found unexpected support from her co-workers at the diner. They created a schedule that allowed her to attend all of Amy's school events while maintaining her income. The customers, many of whom had followed the story in local news, left generous tips with notes of encouragement. One snowy evening, as Amy and her mother walked home from the diner, they passed the fancy downtown office building where her father used to work. Amy squeezed her mother's hand but didn't look afraid anymore. "Mom," she said, her breath making little clouds in the cold air, "I'm glad I told the truth. Even though it was scary." Her mother knelt down in the light dusting of snow, looking into her daughter's eyes. "You're the bravest person I know," she said, pulling her daughter close. "You showed everyone that the truth is stronger than any lie, no matter how powerful someone might seem." As they continued their walk home, neighbors waved from their windows. The community had embraced them, creating a network of support that grew stronger each day. The truth that had emerged in that courtroom had set off a chain reaction of positive change, touching lives far beyond their small family. The investigation was still ongoing, and there would be more challenges ahead. But Amy's mother knew they would face them together, supported by a community that had been awakened to the importance of standing up for what's right, no matter the odds. Their story had become more than just a custody battle, it had become a testament to the power of truth spoken from the heart of a child. As winter settled in, the investigation into Amy's father's activities reached a critical phase. The district attorney's office had assembled a dedicated team to examine every aspect of his business and personal dealings. What they uncovered painted a picture of systematic manipulation that stretched back years. The father's response to his crumbling empire came in waves. First, he attempted to maintain control through his usual tactics, throwing money at the problem. His legal team tried to suppress evidence by claiming attorney-client privilege, but Judge Reynolds saw through these attempts. "The court will not allow legal technicalities to obscure the truth," she declared during a heated hearing. One morning, Amy's mother received an unexpected call from the father's sister, who had remained silent throughout the proceedings. "I can't stay quiet anymore," she said, her voice trembling. "I've watched him do this to others for years, always too afraid to speak up." But seeing Amy's courage, it changed everything. The aunt revealed years of witnessing her brother's manipulative behavior, including similar attempts to control his previous marriage. She provided investigators with documents, emails, and recordings that she had secretly preserved, hoping someday they might help someone stand up to him. At school, Amy began to flourish again. Her teachers noticed she laughed more freely and participated enthusiastically in class discussions. During a parent-teacher conference, her art teacher shared a series of Amy's recent drawings. "Look at the colors she's using now," the teacher pointed out. "Bright yellows, blues, greens, these are the colors of hope and healing." The father's business partners, sensing the shifting winds, began to distance themselves more openly. His company's board of directors called an emergency meeting to discuss the mounting evidence of ethical violations. The father, once the picture of corporate success, found himself facing questions he couldn't manipulate his way out of. "We've received documentation of at least 17 instances where company resources were used to investigate and intimidate individuals involved in personal legal matters," announced the board chairman. The resulting vote to remove him from his position was unanimous. The investigation also uncovered a network of private investigators who had been hired to follow Amy's mother, looking for any evidence that could be used against her in court. One of these investigators, troubled by his role in the scheme, came forward voluntarily. "I was hired to find dirt on the mother," he admitted to investigators. "But all I found was a hard-working woman doing her best to raise her daughter right. When I reported this back, I was told to dig deeper or create something if necessary. That's when I knew I had to get out." The father's desperation grew as his support system crumbled. He made one last attempt to regain control, offering Amy's mother a substantial financial settlement in exchange for dropping all charges and agreeing to joint custody. Her response was swift and clear. "My daughter's truth is not for sale," she told her lawyers. "No amount of money can buy her silence again." The pro bono legal team working with Amy's mother used this attempted bribe as further evidence of the father's continuing manipulation. Judge Reynolds ordered a full psychiatric evaluation of the father, citing concerns about his pattern of controlling behavior. Meanwhile, Amy's law continued to gain support in the state legislature. Advocacy groups shared statistics about children in high-conflict custody cases, using Amy's story to illustrate the need for better protections. The proposed legislation now included provisions for specialized training for family court judges and mandatory psychiatric evaluations in cases involving allegations of manipulation. The diner where Amy's mother worked became an unexpected hub for community support. Local lawyers began holding free legal clinics there on Sunday afternoons, helping other parents navigate the complex family court system. Amy would sit at her usual booth, drawing pictures for the worried parents who came seeking help. One of these parents was a young father fighting a similar battle against a wealthy ex-spouse. "Watching Amy stand up for the truth gave me the courage to fight for my own kids," he shared. "Money shouldn't be able to buy custody of a child." The child advocate, Ms. Thompson, began organizing support groups for children caught in high-conflict custody battles. Amy, with her mother's permission, sometimes spoke to these groups, sharing her story in her own simple words. Her message was always the same: it's okay to tell the truth, even when grown-ups tell you not to. As evidence mounted, the father's legal team began to fracture. His lead attorney, facing potential ethical violations for his role in coaching Amy's testimony, withdrew from the case. Other lawyers on the team followed suit, unwilling to risk their careers defending increasingly indefensible actions. The psychiatric evaluation of the father revealed concerning patterns of narcissistic behavior and a profound inability to prioritize his daughter's well-being over his own desires for control. The evaluating psychiatrist recommended long-term therapy and supervised visitation only if significant progress was made. Through it all, Amy continued to heal. She started taking dance classes at a local studio that offered scholarships to children from single-parent homes. Her mother would watch through the studio window during breaks at work, tears of joy in her eyes as she watched her daughter twirl and leap, free from the weight of secrets. The community's support continued to grow in unexpected ways. Local business owners offered Amy's mother job training opportunities to help her advance her career. A nearby community college provided her with a flexible schedule to take night classes in business management. One evening, as Amy and her mother walked home from the diner, they passed a newspaper stand. The headline read, "Amy's Law Passes First Legislative Hurdle." Amy looked up at her mother with pride. "Mom," she said thoughtfully, "remember when you told me that one person telling the truth can change everything?" Her mother nodded, squeezing her hand. "I think," Amy continued, "it's because when one person tells the truth, it helps other people be brave too." The wisdom in her simple words echoed the broader impact of their story. What had started as one child's moment of courage in a courtroom had grown into a movement for change, touching lives across the state and beyond. The investigation was revealing not just one man's attempts to manipulate justice, but a larger system that needed reform. As they reached their apartment, the lights of the diner below casting a warm glow on the snowy street, both mother and daughter knew that while their journey wasn't over, they were no longer walking it alone. The truth, once spoken, had taken on a life of its own, creating ripples of change that would help protect other families for years to come. Spring arrived, bringing with it new developments in the case that had captured the community's attention. The district attorney's office called a press conference to announce formal charges against Amy's father. The list was extensive: witness tampering, conspiracy to commit fraud, and multiple counts of emotional abuse of a minor. The father's response to the charges revealed just how far he had fallen from his once powerful position. His remaining legal team, now comprised of less prestigious lawyers willing to take his case, attempted to paint him as a victim of circumstance. But the evidence continued to mount against him. "We have documented over 30 instances of deliberate manipulation of the family court system," the district attorney announced. "This case has exposed serious flaws in how we handle high-conflict custody battles, especially when there's a significant imbalance of financial resources." Amy's mother sat in the back of the press conference, holding her daughter's hand. They hadn't planned to attend, but Amy had insisted. "I want to see what telling the truth did," she had said that morning. The mother marveled at her daughter's strength, remembering the frightened little girl from just months ago. The investigation had uncovered a network of influence that stretched through various levels of the legal system. Several court employees came forward with stories of how the father had attempted to use his connections to gain advantages in the custody case. One clerk admitted to being offered bribes to misplace certain documents. At the diner, business was booming. What had started as informal legal clinics had evolved into a full-fledged community resource center. Local lawyers continued to volunteer their time, and social workers began holding regular office hours to help families navigate the system. The owner had to hire extra help to keep up with all the new customers who came to show their support. "Your mama's story is helping so many people," the owner told Amy one afternoon, sliding her favorite strawberry milkshake across the counter. "And it all started because you were brave enough to speak up." The father's business empire continued to crumble as more evidence of his unethical practices came to light. Former employees stepped forward with stories of toxic workplace culture and systematic intimidation. The board of directors, having already removed him from his position, now faced difficult questions about their own oversight. One particularly revealing moment came when his former executive assistant testified before the grand jury. She described years of watching him manipulate people and situations, always careful to maintain a facade of respectability. He would say, "Perception is reality," she testified. But the reality was very different from what people perceived. Amy's law gained momentum in the legislature. Lawmakers from both parties recognized the need for reform in family court proceedings. The bill now included provisions for appointed advocates for children, stricter oversight of evidence presentation, and measures to prevent wealthy parents from using financial resources to manipulate the system. This legislation will help ensure that no child has to carry the burden that Amy did, explained one of the bill's sponsors. Every child deserves to have their voice heard in a safe and supportive environment. The child advocate, Ms. Thompson, had begun writing a book about her experiences working with children in high-conflict custody cases. With permission from Amy and her mother, she included their story as a central example of both the challenges these children face and the possibility of positive change. What makes Amy's case special isn't just that she spoke up, Ms. Thompson explained during a conference presentation. It's that when she did, we as a community finally listened. That's the change we need to see in every case. Amy's mother's life was transforming too. The business management classes she'd been taking at the community college were paying off. The owner of the diner, impressed by her dedication and natural leadership abilities, offered her a position as assistant manager. The flexible schedule allowed her to continue her education while maintaining stability for Amy. One day, Amy's art teacher entered some of her recent drawings in a local children's art competition. The theme was courage, and Amy's piece, titled "The Truth Sets You Free," won first place. The drawing showed a small bird breaking free from a cage, with words like truth, love, and hope written in bright colors around it. The father's sister continued to provide support to the investigation, despite pressure from other family members to stay quiet. She started a support group for family members of controlling individuals, helping others find the courage to break free from toxic relationships. "I watched my brother hurt people for years," she shared during one group session. "But seeing my niece stand up to him, it showed me that no one is too powerful to be held accountable." As spring bloomed, Amy's mother received an unexpected letter. It was from the judge who had presided over their original custody hearing. Judge Reynolds had been following the case closely and had written to express her admiration for both mother and daughter. "In my 30 years on the bench," she wrote, "I have never seen such pure courage as I did that day in my courtroom. You and Amy have not only changed your own lives but have helped create lasting change for countless others." The impact of their story continued to ripple outward. Other jurisdictions began examining their own family court procedures, using Amy's case as a model for reform. Legal aid organizations developed new protocols for identifying and supporting children who might be subject to manipulation in custody battles. One sunny afternoon, as Amy and her mother walked through the park near their apartment, they saw a group of children playing freely on the playground. Amy watched them for a moment before speaking. "Mom," she said thoughtfully, "remember when I was scared all the time? When I thought I had to pretend things were okay even when they weren't?" Her mother nodded, her heart aching at the memory. "I'm not scared anymore," Amy continued, her voice strong and clear. "And maybe because I told the truth, other kids won't have to be scared either." Her mother pulled her close, amazed at the wisdom in her young daughter's words. The truth they had fought for was doing exactly what Amy had hoped, helping others find their own courage to speak up. As they continued their walk, neighbors waved and called out greetings. The community that had rallied around them in their darkest moments had become family. Their story had transformed from one of manipulation and fear to one of courage, hope, and the power of speaking truth to power. The legal proceedings were far from over, but Amy and her mother faced them with confidence, knowing they had something stronger than wealth or influence on their side. They had the truth, and a community of supporters who would stand with them until justice was served. The courthouse was packed on the morning of the father's trial. The case had grown far beyond a simple custody dispute, touching on issues that resonated with people across the state. Local news crews set up their cameras outside, while inside, the wooden benches filled with supporters, advocates, and interested observers. Amy and her mother sat in the front row, surrounded by their growing circle of supporters. The diner owner had closed the restaurant for the morning so the staff could attend. The child advocate, Miss Thompson, sat nearby, her notebook ready to document this important day. The father's appearance had changed dramatically since the initial custody hearing. Gone were the expensive suits and confident demeanor. He sat at the defense table in a modest dark blue suit, his face drawn and tired. His legal team, now on its third iteration, looked nervous as they shuffled through their papers. The district attorney's opening statement laid out a compelling narrative of manipulation and abuse of power. This case, she began, is about more than one man's attempts to control his family through wealth and influence. It's about the systemic failures that allowed such abuse to continue unchecked, and about the extraordinary courage of a child who finally said, enough. As evidence was presented, the full scope of the father's actions became clear. Financial records revealed elaborate schemes to hide assets and manipulate court proceedings. Former employees testified about being coerced into providing false statements about Amy's mother. The father's face grew increasingly pale as his carefully constructed world unraveled. During a break in proceedings, Amy's mother found herself in the courthouse bathroom at the same time as the father's current wife, a woman who had remained silent throughout the ordeal. To her surprise, the woman spoke. "I want you to know," she said quietly, "that I've filed for divorce. Watching your daughter's courage, it made me realize I don't have to live in fear either." The two women shared a moment of understanding before parting ways. The trial's most powerful moment came when the prosecution played recordings found on the father's personal devices. His own voice, cold and calculating, could be heard coaching Amy on what to say in court, threatening consequences if she didn't comply. The courtroom fell silent as they listened to the young girl's frightened responses. Amy, sitting between her mother and Ms. Thompson, held her head high during the playback. When her mother squeezed her hand and whispered, "We can leave if you want," Amy shook her head. "I'm not afraid of his voice anymore," she whispered back. The defense tried to paint the father's actions as those of a concerned parent who had simply gone too far in trying to protect his daughter. But their arguments fell flat against the mountain of evidence and testimony. Even their expert witnesses seemed uncomfortable defending his actions under cross-examination. During the lunch break, Amy and her mother sat on a bench outside the courthouse, sharing sandwiches brought by their diner family. A group of children from a nearby school walked past on a field trip, and one little girl waved at Amy, recognizing her from the news. Amy waved back, smiling. "You know what's different now?" she asked her mother. "I can smile and it's real. I don't have to pretend anymore." The afternoon session brought testimony from mental health professionals who had evaluated the father. They described a pattern of controlling behavior and an inability to recognize the emotional harm he had caused. One psychiatrist noted that the father showed more concern for his lost status and wealth than for his daughter's well-being. As the trial continued, news arrived that Amy's law had passed its final legislative hurdle. The governor had signed it into law, surrounded by advocacy groups and families who had been inspired by Amy's story. The new law would provide unprecedented protections for children in custody cases. The father's sister testified about years of witnessing his manipulative behavior within the family. "He always had to be in control," she explained. "Anyone who challenged him became an enemy to be defeated, even his own child." Her testimony was particularly damaging coming from a family member who had known him all his life. Outside the courthouse, supporters had set up a table collecting signatures for a petition to expand Amy's law to other states. The movement that had started with one child's truth had grown into a national conversation about children's rights in custody battles. Amy's mother's business classes were paying off in unexpected ways. She had started helping other single parents at the diner develop budgeting and business skills, turning her experience into a way to help others achieve financial independence. Late in the afternoon, the prosecution rested its case. The defense team, looking defeated, called only a handful of witnesses, none of whom could effectively counter the overwhelming evidence. The father himself chose not to testify, advised by his lawyers that cross-examination would likely only make things worse. As the day drew to a close, Amy and her mother walked down the courthouse steps, surrounded by their supporters. A light rain had started to fall, but no one seemed to mind. The diner staff had organized a community dinner to celebrate the day's events. "Mom," Amy said as they walked, "remember when you used to tell me that after every storm, the sun comes out again?" Her mother nodded, remembering the dark days when those words had been a desperate hope rather than a reality. "I think our storm is ending," Amy continued, reaching up to catch a raindrop. "And lots of other people are finding their sun too." At the diner, they found the community had organized a surprise. The walls were decorated with children's artwork from local schools, all themed around courage and truth. Amy's winning picture held the central spot, its message of freedom and hope inspiring others to share their stories. The father's trial would continue for several more days, but the outcome seemed increasingly certain. More importantly, the changes sparked by Amy's courage had taken on a life of their own. Support groups had formed, laws had changed, and people had found their voices. As evening settled over the city, Amy sat in her usual booth, surrounded by people who had become family. She pulled out her sketchbook and began to draw, her strokes confident and colorful. On the page, a small figure stood tall, surrounded by a growing circle of light that pushed back the darkness. "What are you drawing?" her mother asked, sliding into the booth beside her. "The future," Amy replied simply, adding more rays of light to her picture. "It's bright." The final days of the trial brought a sense of anticipation to the community. The courthouse steps had become a gathering place for supporters, many holding signs with messages of encouragement. Local coffee shops donated hot beverages to the people waiting outside, creating an atmosphere of solidarity in the crisp morning air. Inside the courtroom, the defense made their closing arguments first. Their strategy had shifted from denying the father's actions to pleading for leniency based on his recent acknowledgement of his behavior and willingness to seek therapy. The jury listened impassively as his lawyer spoke about rehabilitation and second chances. The prosecution's closing argument was powerful in its simplicity. The district attorney stood before the jury, her voice clear and determined. "This case began with the courage of a child," she said. "A 7-year-old girl who showed us that the truth, even whispered, is stronger than power and privilege shouted from the rooftops." As the jury deliberated, Amy and her mother returned to their daily routines, though nothing was really routine anymore. The diner had become a symbol of community resilience, with people driving from neighboring towns just to have a meal there and show their support. The legal clinic had expanded to 3 days a week, helping families navigate their own custody battles. Amy's mother had surprising news of her own. The community college where she'd been taking business classes had offered her a scholarship to complete her degree full-time. The diner owner and staff had worked out a schedule that would allow her to pursue her education while maintaining her assistant manager position. "You inspired me," she told Amy one evening as they walked home. "Watching you be brave made me brave too. Made me believe I could do more than I thought possible." Word spread through the courthouse that the jury had reached a verdict after 2 days of deliberation. The community held its breath as people filed into the courtroom for the final time. Amy and her mother sat in their usual spot, surrounded by their support system. The father stood as the jury forewoman prepared to read the verdict. The transformation in him was stark, gone was any trace of his former arrogance. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the truth that had finally caught up with him. "On the count of witness tampering in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty," the forewoman began. The list continued, with guilty verdicts on multiple counts of emotional abuse, conspiracy to commit fraud, and obstruction of justice. The father's shoulders slumped with each pronouncement. Judge Reynolds, who had returned to preside over the criminal trial, thanked the jury for their service before addressing the father directly. Her words were measured but firm. "The damage you have done extends far beyond your immediate family," she said. "You abused not only your daughter's trust but the very system designed to protect her." The sentencing would come later, but the verdict itself felt like a weight lifting from the community's shoulders. Outside the courthouse, people hugged and cried. News cameras captured the moment as Amy and her mother emerged, walking tall among their supporters. A reporter approached Amy, microphone in hand, asking how she felt about the verdict. Amy looked at her mother, who nodded encouragingly, before responding. "I feel happy," she said simply, "not because my dad is in trouble, but because telling the truth helped other people be brave too." The impact of the case continued to ripple outward. The State Bar Association launched an ethics review of all lawyers involved in the original custody case. Law schools began using the case as a teaching tool in their family law courses. Social workers cited it when training new advocates for children in the court system. Amy's law was already showing results in other custody cases. Judges were implementing stricter protocols for evaluating evidence and testimony. Children were being given more opportunities to speak safely about their experiences. The power of wealth to influence outcomes was being challenged and checked. The father's sister had become an vocal advocate for family court reform, speaking at conferences and working with advocacy groups. "My brother's actions were extreme," she would say, "but they exposed problems that existed long before this case. Every child deserves to have their voice heard." Ms. Thompson's book about children in high-conflict custody cases was nearing publication. She had interviewed dozens of families, but Amy's story remained the heart of the narrative. "What makes this case special," she wrote, "is not just what happened in that courtroom, but what happened afterward, how one child's courage sparked a movement for change." At school, Amy's teachers noticed she had become a quiet leader among her peers. Other children sought her out when they needed someone to listen or stand up for them. The school counselor used her story, with permission, to help other children understand the importance of speaking up about difficult situations at home. The Diners Community Resource Center had grown to include support groups for children of divorce, led by trained counselors. Amy sometimes sat in on these sessions, drawing pictures with the other children and showing them that there was hope on the other side of their struggles. One evening, as Amy and her mother prepared dinner in their apartment, they heard music and laughter from the street below. Looking out the window, they saw their neighbors had organized a spontaneous celebration. The verdict had been formally recorded, and the community wanted to mark the moment. "Should we go down?" her mother asked. Amy nodded, but then paused. "Mom," she said, "do you think Dad will ever understand what he did wrong?" Her mother knelt beside her, choosing her words carefully. "I don't know, sweetheart. But what's more important is that you understood what was right, and you were brave enough to say it." As they joined their neighbors on the street, someone had set up speakers playing upbeat music. The diner was serving free milkshakes, and children were drawing with chalk on the sidewalk. Amy found herself surrounded by friends from school, all excited to be part of the celebration. Looking around at the faces of people who had become extended family, Amy felt a sense of peace she hadn't known was possible. The truth that had seemed so scary to tell had become a source of strength, not just for her, but for an entire community. The stars were just becoming visible in the evening sky when Amy's mother gathered her close. "You know what?" she said softly. "You didn't just tell the truth that day in court. You showed everyone what courage looks like. And that's a light that keeps on shining." Amy smiled, watching the celebration around them. The fear that had once filled her life had been replaced by something stronger: hope, truth, and the knowledge that sometimes the smallest voice can create the biggest change. 1 year had passed since that first brave moment in the courtroom. The seasons had turned full circle, and the autumn leaves were once again falling outside the county courthouse. But this time, Amy wasn't there to face a custody battle, she was there to celebrate. The governor had chosen the courthouse steps as the location to announce the expansion of Amy's law to include new protections for children in the family court system. A crowd had gathered, larger than anyone expected, filled with families whose lives had been touched by Amy's story. Amy sat in the front row with her mother, both dressed in sunny yellow, Amy's choice, because it's the color of hope. Her mother, now in her final semester of business school, wore her student ID proudly alongside her diner manager badge. They had come so far from the fearful days of the previous year. The father had received his sentence months ago, 5 years in prison followed by extensive probation and mandatory counseling. But more meaningful than the punishment was the change his case had sparked in the legal system. The judgment had set precedents that were already being cited in courtrooms across the country. Today, the governor announced, we're not just celebrating a law. We're celebrating courage. The courage of a child who reminded us that justice doesn't belong to the wealthy or powerful, it belongs to those who speak the truth. The diner had grown into something remarkable. What started as a small community resource center had evolved into a full-fledged non-profit organization, with the diner serving as its heart. Amy's mother managed both the restaurant and the foundation's daily operations, putting her business education to work helping other families find their voice. Ms. Thompson's book had become a bestseller, not just in legal circles but among general readers who found hope in its message. She had dedicated it to Amy, writing simply, to the little girl who showed us that the truth, spoken from the heart, can change the world. The father's sister had become a regular speaker at family court conferences, sharing her perspective on recognizing and preventing manipulation in custody cases. She and Amy had developed a special bond, building a new kind of family connection based on truth and understanding rather than power and control. Amy's artwork had taken on new life. Her simple drawings about truth and courage had been turned into posters that now hung in family courts and children's advocacy centers across the state. Each one carried a small signature, Amy, age 8, truth teller. The school system had implemented new training programs for teachers and counselors, helping them better identify and support children in high-conflict custody situations. Amy's former art teacher had developed a special program using creative expression to help children communicate their feelings about difficult family situations. On this particular morning, as the governor finished speaking, Amy was asked to cut the ribbon for the new Children's Advocacy Center being opened in the courthouse. As she held the oversized scissors, she looked out at the crowd and saw many familiar faces, the diner staff, her teachers, Ms. Thompson, and countless others who had become part of their extended family. "Would you like to say something?" the governor asked Amy quietly. Amy nodded and stepped up to the microphone. Her voice, once silenced by fear, rang out clear and strong. "A year ago, I was scared to tell the truth," she said. "But my mom always told me that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what's right anyway." The crowd listened in respectful silence as she continued. "Now I know that when one person tells the truth, it helps other people be brave too. And when we're all brave together, we can make things better." Her simple words brought tears to many eyes in the crowd. Her mother watched proudly as her daughter, no longer the frightened child of a year ago, spoke with the wisdom that comes from facing fear and choosing truth. After the ceremony, they held a celebration at the diner. The place was packed with people from all walks of life, lawyers who volunteered at the legal clinic, families who had found help through the resource center, teachers, counselors, and community members who had stood by them through everything. The walls of the diner had become a living testament to their journey. Children's artwork hung alongside newspaper articles and photos documenting the changes of the past year. A new addition was a framed copy of Amy's Law, surrounded by thank you notes from families it had already helped. Amy's mother had received news that morning that she'd been accepted into a bachelor's program in nonprofit management. The diner owner had already promised to promote her to full manager upon graduation, overseeing both the restaurant and the growing community center. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, Amy and her mother took their usual walk home. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and new beginnings. They stopped at the small park where they had spent so many anxious moments during the difficult days of the previous year. "Mom," Amy said, sitting on their favorite bench, "remember when you said that telling the truth was like throwing a stone in a pond? That the ripples keep going even after the stone sinks?" Her mother nodded, remembering that conversation from the early days of their journey. "I see our ripples everywhere now," Amy continued, watching the leaves dance in the evening breeze. "In the diner, at school, in all the people who come to get help. And every time someone else tells their truth, they make new ripples too." Her mother pulled her close, marveling at how much they had both grown. The fear that had once dominated their lives had been transformed into strength, their silence into a voice that helped others find their own. As they walked the final blocks home, neighbors waved from their windows. The community that had embraced them in their darkest hours had become something more, a network of hope and support that continued to grow and strengthen. Amy's story had started with a moment of courage in a courtroom, but it hadn't ended there. It lived on in every child who found their voice, in every parent who discovered their strength, and in every person who learned that the truth, even whispered, had the power to change the world. As they reached their apartment, the lights of the diner glowing warmly below, Amy took one last look at the evening sky. The stars were just beginning to appear, bright points of light in the gathering dusk. Like truth, she thought, they were always there, you just had to be brave enough to look for them.